Welcome back, everyone. My name is Aaron, and this is Mind Science, episode 19. In today's video, I'd like to tackle a question that I hear pretty frequently, and that is the question of, can we actually kill the ego? And this question contains an inherent flaw in it, which is what I'd like to try and address in today's episode. So the flaw within the question is the idea that you can kill your ego. You can't kill something that doesn't exist. But many people will try to assert this notion that, well, you can't kill your ego because your ego is what makes you a human. Now, even this very statement is obviously an ego strategy to try and get you to feel apprehensive about pursuing spiritual liberation. But if it were true that the ego is what makes you a human, then obviously nobody would want to kill that because that's the whole point of us being here. But the idea that the ego is what makes you human is emphatically untrue, and I'll explain why. Many people in the spiritual community say that the ego is your sense of self. And this is the first point I would like to make loud and clear in this video. The ego is not your sense of self. The ego is your false sense of self. Your true sense of self is the I am principle within you, the ungiven knowledge of your own existence. And this can never be taken from you. But furthermore, the ego is also not that which makes you human, because that would be like saying that the autopilot function on a jet airplane is the entire airplane. It's true to say that the autopilot function can control the airplane, but with a pilot at the helm, the plane can also function perfectly without it. So, transcending the ego is simply about discovering who the real pilot of the airplane is. The ego can be seen as the autopilot function of the human psyche. The ego is not an entity that has any free will or autonomy. It is a software program that Mother Nature has encoded into the human brain through evolution. The ego cannot be killed because the ego is simply an effect in consciousness. The ego effect is created when we do not know who we are. Ego is a misidentification. When your sense of self is not understood as the awareness or consciousness, it is misidentified as the thoughts which are created in the mind. It is mistakenly believed that I am the thinker of thoughts, which is no more true than saying I am the beater of my heart and the circulator of my blood. These are all an automatic function of the body. The thoughts that appear in your mind are no more your doing than your heartbeat is. When this is not understood, then each thought is endowed with a sense of personal identity. This personal identity amplifies the power and magnitude of these thoughts dramatically, and this is where our mental dysfunction comes from. The ego is the survival program of the human psyche. It only has three primary functions: identity, self-preservation, and control. Firstly, the ego needs an identity to know where it stands in the social hierarchy. This is why the ego has an endless lust for identity. It seeks to attach itself to everything it can get its hands on, because to the ego, identity is salvation. This is, of course, an illusion, because all identity actually does for you is make you psychologically vulnerable to attack. Once the ego has an identity, it then needs to constantly defend that identity, making self-preservation its second function. This is a type of internal self-preservation in which the goal is to preserve the standing in the social hierarchy at all cost. This is why people get easily offended and triggered when someone challenges an identity. For example, the biggest guy in the gym walks around with his head held high, feeling comfortably superior, until someone bigger walks in. Suddenly, his identity feels threatened, so he needs to grunt louder while he lifts so that everyone in the gym will pay attention to him instead. This is a basic self-preservation tactic of the ego, seeking to preserve its identity. And this need to protect identity is what causes the ego to seek to control everything in its reality. This is why the ego constantly needs to label everything, to state its opinion and formulate judgments. This is the way the ego fabricates an illusory sense of control over a reality that is completely out of its control. Every thought the ego creates is just an attempt to fulfill one of these three objectives, and it has no ability to operate outside of these three functions. So with this understanding in mind, we can see that the ego is not any facet of your personality or self-expression, but simply any identification with it. Defining it as the sum total of anything that makes you human is, in my opinion, extraordinarily inaccurate and unhelpful. For example, I once saw a video where a spiritual teacher asked somebody, "Do you like chocolate?" "Yes?" "Then that's your ego." So you can immediately see just how confusing this definition can become. If we want to transcend the ego and the dysfunction it creates for us, then we need to have a clear and concise definition for what it is. And if we define it as anything that causes human expression at all, then we have no idea what we're trying to transcend anymore, and we may as well just give up hope. I mean, if enjoying chocolate is ego, then who the hell would want to be enlightened? Try and imagine Eckhart Tolle eating a bite of chocolate and saying, "I feel nothing." It's no wonder many people have a subconscious fear of achieving enlightenment, because they imagine themselves, after having transcended everything, just sitting on a couch and drooling and staring at the wall. So it doesn't help anyone to have such a broad definition of what the ego is. The Buddha defined enlightenment as simply the end of suffering. So if we want to get specific about what ego is, we could define it as simply any function of the mind that creates psychological suffering. The next question would be, what functions of our mind create suffering? The answer is, you guessed it, identification, self-preservation, and control. So let's imagine that you came over to my house for my birthday party, and I served you a dessert tray and said, "Do you prefer chocolate or vanilla?" There's nothing egoic about saying, "I prefer chocolate, thanks." To a self-aware being, all this statement means is that, in this body, for whatever reason, the universe prefers chocolate. In another body, it may prefer vanilla. But there is no separate self who enjoys it. There's just the enjoyment itself. However, it would be ego if your response was something like, "Chocolate is my favorite flavor. Everyone knows that I'm a chocolate fanatic." Or, "Chocolate is way better than vanilla." You can see the ego identifying with the love of chocolate through these statements. And this is what is unnecessary. Although the enlightened person may prefer chocolate over vanilla, they aren't making a judgment about it that it's better just because they like it more. An enlightened person would also never claim that chocolate is their favorite flavor, because they understand that the flow of life is dynamic, not static. So a preference might change in any moment. On one occasion, you might find yourself craving vanilla more than chocolate. Who knows? So there's never a reason to make absolute statements about anything unless it's coming from an ego that's trying to prove something. So you can always tell if something is coming from an identity because it will be easily offended and will constantly feel the need to defend and prove itself. It is true to say that before spiritual liberation, a lot of the ways in which we express ourselves is from ego. But that is not to say that it has to be this way. The way in which most people express themselves is being pressed through the filter of all their identities. This distorts our natural, authentic personality because the ego laces everything we say with little forms of self-defense. We are subtly trying to prove something, to gain validation, or to defend a self-image. So our identification with these self-images the ego collects distorts our ability to be authentic in a myriad of ways. But when you begin to transcend your ego, you begin to recognize these subtle ways that the ego influences your personal expression, and immediately upon seeing it, you no longer want it. You lose all interest in constantly needing to defend or prove yourself, because you see the inherent weakness and victimization it's coming from. So in returning to the question, can we kill the ego? As you can already see, the answer is no. You cannot kill a misidentification. You can only see it for what it is. Once you see it for what it is, you begin to lose interest in it. And you don't need to transcend something you have no interest in. It simply disappears from your reality. So the ego dies when you no longer have use for it. The ego is simply an illusion. It is the voice of separation and victimization. And in ancient times, this part of our psyche was useful to our physical survival and evolution as a species. It has served us very well in many ways, helping us create technology, civilization, and so forth. But the ego has also been responsible for every atrocity the human race has ever committed. So like everything in evolution, it eventually outlives its usefulness, and evolution begins the process of discarding it. This is the process we are in right now. We are collectively evolving out of the ego. Therefore, it is the destiny of the human race to achieve enlightenment collectively. How long this will take is unknown, but we are already seeing the beginning stages of it. When a child is learning to walk, it's going to fall down and hurt itself in the process. But eventually, it learns how to walk without hurting itself. Likewise, we as a species are in the process of learning how to be self-aware without hurting ourselves, aka without suffering. Once the pilot learns how to fly the plane, he doesn't need the autopilot function anymore. So yes, the ego cannot be completely killed because it is simply a software program that responds in accordance to your need for it. So it will always be lying dormant in your psyche, existing in potential. But once you see the ego for what it is and detach your sense of self from it, you will not ever return back to it again. In the same way that you would never walk down the same dark alley at night where you got robbed at gunpoint 3 years ago. You could do it, of course, but why would you want to? So if we change the question to can you get rid of the ego, the answer is yes and no. Because no one who's transcended psychological suffering would ever willingly return to it again. So in summary, nothing whatsoever of value is lost when the ego is transcended. In fact, without the heavy, wet blanket of mental identity weighing you down, your most authentic self is able to shine through at last. And for the first time, you're able to see your own uniqueness in the way that the universe created you. And this is why I often say that self-love is simply self-knowledge. To know yourself truly is to love yourself. So as long as you don't know who you are, then you will continually mistake yourself for the voice of separation in your mind. And this is why we call it self-realization. When I realize that I am not the talking voice in my head, but the consciousness which observes it, I am free. And this is not some high, difficult achievement that's only available to true spiritual masters. It is available to each and every one of us right now in this moment, if we truly want it. All we have to do is be willing to look deep within ourselves and see what it is we're still holding on to. Before we can transcend our blindness, we have to see our blindness. So freedom is just the choice to stop tolerating suffering, because all suffering is an illusion. It is impossible to suffer from anything unless I first mistake myself for something I am not. And this truth is summarized beautifully in A Course in Miracles. How does one overcome illusions? Surely not by force or anger, nor by opposing them in any way. Merely by letting reason tell you that they contradict reality. They go against what must be true. What merely is needs no defense and offers none. Only illusions need defense because of weakness. Everything that needs defense you do not want, for anything that needs defense will weaken you.